Don't lose heart, oh my soul, oh my soul. And don't give up. There is hope, there is always hope. And there is peace in the storm, in the storm. And don't forget, He is Lord of all. There's a King, there is a King of glory. There is a God who saves, one who is strong and mighty. Freedom is in His name. Open the gates of heaven, lift up the shout of praise. There is a lion roaring, Jesus the King of glory. So lift your eyes, stand in awe, stand in awe. There is one, only one, where our help comes from. So lift your eyes, lift your eyes. There is a King of glory. There is a God who saves, one who is strong and mighty. Freedom is in His name. So open the gates of heaven, lift up a shout of praise. There is a lion roaring, Jesus the King of glory. Nations bow, mountains shake, and nations bow, and mountains shake at the sound of just one name. And over all, Jesus reigns. I know, oh I know, nations bow, and mountains shake at the sound of just one name. And over all, Jesus reigns. I know, oh I know. There's a King, there is a King of glory. There is a God who saves, one who is strong and mighty. Freedom is in His name. Open the gates of heaven, lift up a shout of praise. There is a lion roaring, Jesus the King of glory. There is a lion roaring, He's Jesus the King of glory. People come together, strangers, neighbors, our blood is one. Children of generations, of every nation, of kingdom come. So don't let your heart be troubled. Hold your head up high, don't fear no evil. But fix your eyes on this one truth: God is madly in love with you. So take courage, hold on, and be strong. Remember where our help comes from. Oh. Swing wide, all you heavens. Let the praise go up as the walls come down. All creation and everything with breath repeat the sound. All his children, clean hands, pure hearts, good grace, good God. His name is Jesus. Swing wide, all you heavens, and let the praise go up as the walls come down. And all creation and everything with breath repeat the sound. All his children with clean hands, pure hearts, good grace, good God. His name is Jesus. Swing wide, all you heavens. All your promises are yes and amen. Beautiful Savior, you have brought me near. You pulled me from the ashes and you have broken everything. Blessed Redeemer, you're my help. And Lord, I can't help but sing, Lord. And we sing, faithful you are. Lord, faithful forever you
Father, we thank you for your promises. We thank you for the fact that we can rely on you, that we can trust you. In a world where everything seems like it's vying for our attention, everything wants our trust, everything else wants our attention. We pray that we would remind ourselves of your faithfulness time and time and time again. The way that you have endured, the way that you have been long-standing for years and years and decades and generations that you have been faithful. So today we pray that you would remind us of that as we look at your teachings. We look at what we are to do in the midst of these things. That we would remind ourselves of your faithfulness time and time again. Praise your name. Amen. You can be seated. Good morning. Good morning. Glad you're here. And yeah, last night we got to celebrate Janessa's wedding. A lot of you got to watch that online, and glad you got to be a part of that. I just got a text from her just now, and Janessa, if you're watching this online, stop. Just stop. Don't. You can watch it later. It's fine. Yeah, this is not a time where you need to be logging in for this. So, anyways, yeah. Anyways, I'm glad you're here today. I'm a little groggy. I'm a little tired. I bring the party when it's a wedding, guys. And so I did my best. I did what I could. And so I'm exhausted. But I'm glad you're here today as we spend some time outside and we go through some things together. I don't know if you ever had a moment when you were growing up where suddenly you had like a realization of things where you were like, oh, the thing that I thought was such a big deal, the thing I thought that was such an important thing or whatever, you're like, man, that's really not that important, or it's not even what I thought it was. I remember Jane, when she was little, there was a place she loved to go. It's this really high-class establishment. You've probably never heard of it because it's like real expensive and hard to get into. It's called Chuck E. Cheese. It's like it's a nice place if you want to get like hepatitis. It's really, really nice. And so we would go there, and Jane loved it. And we would go there quite a bit, actually, and it was near her school, and so we'd go there after school. And I remember the first time we went, there was this, if you've ever been in one, there's like these animatronic rats that are standing up around the place. You know what I'm talking about? They're these big rats that sing along with songs, and they move. And Jane, the first time we went, was not having it. Like, she would stare at that thing and look at it and be like, I'm not going near that thing. And honestly, I didn't blame her. And she was like very intimidated by it. But the second time we went, I realized she wasn't intimidated by it because she thought it was scary, but because she thought it was super cool. And she was like, this is a really impressive rat who is singing and dancing. Which, I mean, guys, if you had a singing and dancing rat that was 8 feet tall, either it is the scariest thing you've ever seen or the coolest thing. You decide. But there's no in between. Thanks for taking care of the donuts, Toby. Somebody's got to do it. So we were watching this rat sing and dance, and it would keep moving. And then the third time we went, she wanted to go near it. She actually wanted to go up to it. And so we got close to it, and we stood there, and she just stared at this singing and dancing rat that she was like, man, look at this thing. And you could tell she was in awe of how impressive an 8-foot singing and dancing rat is. And again, that is something to behold in and of itself. But a couple years later, we went back to Chuck E. Cheese, and Jane was a little bit older. And she was a little bit taller, and she'd seen some things and been around, a little bit longer in her life. And we went back to Chuck E. Cheese, and I remember we went in, and we sat down, and we look over at this rat that sings songs and dances. And I was like, Jane, do you want to go over and see it? And so we walked over to it, and this time she was just very hesitant. She kept looking at it from different angles, and we got up to it. And guys, when we got to it, you could hear it like squeaking. And like, it was not, I mean, if you've been to a Chuck E. Cheese recently, they're not exactly kept up super well. And it was like squeaking and making all these noises and whatever. It was like grinding gears. And we got to it, and Jane looks at it, and she just stares for a second. And she looks at me, and she's like, Dad, that's not real. Like, oh, yeah? She's like, yeah, not real. And we left, and that was it. It wasn't a big deal anymore. She had gotten over it. She was past it. Now, here's the thing. Here's why I want you to understand this, is because what we're going to look at today is we look at these last 7 days of Jesus' life before he goes to the cross, like these last things that he does. Today, one of the things that we're going to experience is him seeing some things that people might have held very dear. And I think some things that we hold very dear today in a different way. He takes these things that everybody's thinking are a big deal or so impressive or so important. He's taking those things and he's deconstructing them. And then he's actually going to not just talk about deconstruction, he's going to kind of destruct a bunch of things. He's going to talk about actual destruction. Then he's going to give some directions. But we got to start with understanding that there's some things that maybe we've been holding dear, some things that they were holding dear that Jesus is going to deconstruct first. So what happens, if you remember in the timeline of events, I'm just going to warn you, today's going to be a little bit weird, but as you go through the timeline of events of this last week, today is one of the strangest moments in that last 7 days. Remember on Sunday we talked about Jesus came in, the triumphal entry. It was the first Sunday of the series. He comes in on the Sunday of that week. He comes in triumphal entry. He's on the donkey. There's another king coming in from the other side while Jesus rides in from one side of town. We see that whole thing play out. Again, go back and watch that if you missed that. The next day, we see that Jesus goes into the temple. He turns over tables. He makes everybody mad. And then we see that he leaves town after doing that, comes back into town. He makes a fig tree wither. Again, that was last week. You can go back and find that. He makes a fig tree wither. So far, he's really just making everybody angry, doing a lot of things. And then what he's going to do is he's going to go back to the temple. Remember, this is during the Passover week. Everybody's there. He's going to start doing something that maybe we wouldn't expect, but he's going to start teaching. This is actually Jesus' last real teaching that he does before he goes to the cross. And I'm just going to tell you, it's going to get weird. We're not going to go through all of it. If you want to go through it yourself, you're welcome to. And if you have questions about it as you go through it, I am happy to receive emails about this, because I'll just tell you, it's going to be a lot to handle. This is Jesus' last teaching, and he's got a lot to say. So he goes to the temple, and he starts to have this conversation. We're going to pick up in Matthew chapter 24. If you want to read Matthew chapter 23, he basically just yells at all the religious people and tells them they're all bad at things. And it's a very uplifting passage. If you want to go through that, you're welcome to. Again, email me if you have questions about that. But in Matthew 24, that's where we're going to begin. I'm just going to tell you up front. I know we have like little people here. I know there's a lot of things going on. In this teaching, Jesus does talk about, in some form or fashion here, the end of the maybe world. Okay, and we'll get into that in a second. I know that's a lot to handle, and it's like, you're like, man, I didn't come here to talk about that maybe. But let me just say, I think it's actually something that a lot of people have been talking about. I don't know if you've watched any religious, any kind of like things, maybe you've listened to people talk about it, or you've seen people talk about it. This is a thing that takes up a lot of mental space in the Christian realm. We think about the end of the world like a lot, actually. And we always think it's the end of the world. I don't know if you've noticed this or not. We've thought it's the end of the world almost every time, and so far it hasn't been. I don't know if you've noticed that. It hasn't been yet. We've been wrong literally every single time, but we still keep trying it. And actually, I hear it a lot right now in our culture because of things we're going through. And we're going to get into that a little bit today. But this is Jesus' last teaching. He's going to talk about that just a little bit. And I don't know if you're like one of those people who doesn't like to think about that, or maybe you're a person who thinks about it actually quite a bit. We were driving in the car the other day, and we were talking about the sun, and I had read this really cool thing about how the sun puts out so much energy every single day, and that right now our entire world is only using about 1% of 1 day's worth of the sun's energy in an entire year. We use 1% of 1 day's worth in an entire year. That's how little we're using of the sun's energy. And I was telling Marie, because I'm a nerd and this is what excites me about my life, I'm telling her this stuff and she's like not interested at all. She didn't really care. And the kids are in the back saying like, so we're using just a little bit of the sun? Yeah. And they're like, man, that's really impressive. The sun has so much power. And I was like, yeah, it's amazing how much power the sun has. And then they were like, so what happens if we like lose the sun? And I was like, well, we're not here anymore. And we go, I think, traveling off into space somewhere. And Marie instantly was like, I don't want to talk about this. And she was done. And the kids were like, why not, Mom? And she's like, I don't like to think about this. And that was it. Maybe you're one of those people where you're like, I don't even want to talk about it. That's fine. That's understandable. But maybe you're on the other side where you're like, no, I actually think about this quite a bit, or I've heard people talking about this a lot. I'm hoping we can clear some of that up today as we look at what Jesus teaches here. So if you have a Bible or a phone or whatever, you're welcome to look at Matthew chapter 24 is where we're going to begin with what Jesus starts to teach. So right off the bat, we get to this deconstruction that's going to happen. So in Matthew chapter 24, it says this: Jesus left the temple and was walking away when his disciples came up to him to call his attention to its building. So he's at the temple. Remember, he's teaching in the temple. He just came from there. He just yelled at a bunch of Pharisees, but he's coming out of the temple. And the disciples run up to him because they're like, hey, look at this. And they call his attention to the temple. Now, I don't think we can fully understand what the temple meant to them. I don't know if we have spaces like this in our lives that are this influential in our lives to us. But the temple to these guys was everything. First of all, it was a feat of engineering. It really was. It was a huge facility. It was massive. It had been built it was built by Solomon originally, but this is actually called Herod's temple. Not because Herod was a person who even believed in Jesus or in God. He wasn't a Jew at all. But Herod had rebuilt the temple for the Jews. It was called Herod's temple. And it was so massive and just so impressive. And so first of all, it was like a feat of engineering. I don't know if you ever like go to those places where you're like, how did they make this thing? I still, to be honest with you, every time I'm at Epcot, that ball thing, I don't understand it. I'm like, I know that I ride through it, but how did they make a golf ball that is held up by these 3 pillars that I can go ride a ride in? It still blows my mind. I honestly am very impressed by it every time I'm there. So maybe you have a thing like that, like it's something like that. It's a feat of engineering, but it's also a focal point of like their education. All these guys, all these disciples would have been brought up in the education system of the temple. I don't know if you ever go back to your college campus or you've been back to your high school for a 10 or 15 or 20 or however old you are reunion. Maybe you've been back to a college for that or a high school for that. And you kind of have that sentimental part of you, right, that walks on campus. You kind of want to see the things that you remember. You want to go, remember all the things that you used to do or whatever. It might have some of that to them. It also really is the focal point, not just of education or of their engineering. It's also a focal point, actually, of their entire ethnicity. The entire Jewish culture revolves around this temple. It is where everything happens. I don't think that we can fully understand what they're calling his attention to. So Jesus just walked out of the temple, and they're like, but Jesus, look at this thing. And notice the deconstruction that happens. So notice this with me. Watch these verses very closely. It says, Jesus left the temple. Okay, temple is the first word. Now notice the next thing it says. And the disciples came up to him, calling his attention to its buildings. See how the temple is like a spiritual and it's all these things to them. But notice the next time it's called something. It's not called a temple like where God dwells. They took it down a notch. What is it now? It's just a building, right? There's deconstruction happening of this building already. And then the next thing that happens, it says, notice what Jesus says. He turns to them, and this is what he says. This is Jesus talking. He talks to the disciples, and he says, do you see all these things? We just went from a temple, the place where God's presence dwells, the place where all these things have happened, to buildings, to Jesus calling them things. They're just things. And then he says, truly I tell you, not one stone will be left on another. Every one will be thrown down. He just took it from temple to building to things to just a bunch of stones. See the deconstruction that just happened? He took this thing that we thought was so important and so big and so great, and he deconstructs it down to its bare core, and he says it's just a bunch of stones. And by the way, who created the stones that it was made of? Oh, Jesus. He's reminding them of who's in charge here, right? Where this came from. Don't be so impressed by the man-made things that you're seeing. Let's look at the deeper thing and who made that. Let's not worship the creation. Let's worship the creator behind it. So then the next thing that happens here, it says, as Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately. So this is just the disciples. And they say, tell us, when will this happen? And what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? Okay, so here's where we have to get this right. Okay, so if you've read Matthew 24, this is actually a part, it's called the Olivet disclosure or the Olivet discourse, because he's on the Mount of Olives. And it actually is a big field, a lot like what we're sitting in today. Jesus sat down in a mount of a big grassy field, and he's sitting down, and his disciples come to him and they say, we want to know something. And they ask two questions here. Now, if you read through this, a lot of people say this is how we will know when it's the end of times. Okay? Okay, follow me for just a second. I'm going to ask you just to kind of track with me on this, okay? I know this is just like a lot of theology. I promise we're going to get to what this means for us in just a second. But a lot of people would say this is where we talk about the end of the world. This is where Jesus talks about the end of the world. But notice there's two questions asked here, okay? There's two questions asked. One is they ask, when will this happen? What is the this they're talking about? When are you saying that the temple is going to fall? Does that make sense? When is that going to happen? You just said that the temple is going to be going from this temple down to stones. When is that happening? That's the first question. Then notice the second question. It says, and what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? Do you notice there's two questions here? It's not just one question. It's not just when will the world end and when will all these things happen that we're talking about, the end times or whatever you want to call them. It's not that question only. There's two questions. The first question is, when will the temple fall? Now, the temple actually falls in 70 AD, just 70 years after Jesus. We see actually the temple does fall. It is literally torn to shreds, and it has not been rebuilt since that day fully. Still is not the way it was before. The temple did fall, and it fell actually not that long after Jesus left the earth, okay? So in 70 AD, we do see the temple fall. But notice what Jesus is going to do. Here's how we have to read this passage, is we have to understand two things about this passage. One is that Jesus is not just talking about right now, and secondly, he is not just talking about then. He's talking about both. Okay, so follow me. I'm going to try to give you a really clunky analogy that I kind of came up with that I hope makes sense out of what's happening here. I remember a few months ago, we were down in Clearwater, and we were at the beach. And so we got in the water, and we walked out a little ways, and it got really deep, right? We got into this really deep water, and the kids were with me, and we got to the spot where they had to swim. Like, it was too deep for them to walk, and we started to have to come back up. So we went swimming. They're swimming now. But then I realized if I walked a little bit further, I am taller than them, and my wife, too, because she's like their height. And so I was walking out, and I realized that if I kept walking and just kept my head above water, I would get to a shelf. And there was like this shelf that was a little bit higher up. And I got to the shelf, and the kids saw me standing out there, and they're like, hey, that's like, you're way out there, but like you're standing up. You're still in this shallow water. How did you do that? It was a magic trick. And I was like, I'm just really good at swimming, so don't worry about it. And so I'm standing on the shelf, like pretending like I'm treading water, acting like I'm really good at things. And they got out there, and they realized that they were doing the same thing too. And we look back, we're standing on this shallow water, but we're looking back at the shore, and they're like, Dad, we have never been this far out before. We are way out here. I was like, you're right, we are way out here. And they were like, so we're like in the Atlantic Ocean, like we're like way out in the Atlantic. I was like, not really, we're still in the Gulf. And they were like, so we're in the Gulf. I was like, yeah, we're in the Gulf of Mexico. And they were like, but isn't that part of like the Atlantic Ocean, or is that part of the Pacific Ocean? I was like, oh, this is a tricky question. Yes, this is part of the Atlantic Ocean, but we're in the Gulf. And they were like, well, how much further do we have to get until we are in the Atlantic Ocean when we leave the Gulf? How much further do we have to get to the Atlantic? And I was like, oh, well, we're kind of there now, but we're also kind of here. I can't tell you where the Gulf ends and the Atlantic begins. Does this make sense, what I'm saying? I can't tell you where one ends and the other begins. I can't tell you how far exactly you have to get until you're in one, because you're kind of in both, right? Does this make sense? This is the way Jesus is going to answer this question. He's not just going to talk about the future at the end of times. He's going to talk about even things that are happening right now. He's going to talk about both at the same time. This is what we call apocalyptic literature. We don't have a parallel for this, by the way, guys. In English, we really don't have a parallel for what apocalyptic literature is. But when you and I hear the word apocalypse, we think end of the world, right? That's what we think. In Greek, that word apocalypse, which is the word here, apocalypsis is the word in Greek. That word in Greek actually just means a very wise or a very penetrating statement. It just means that it's a very wise statement with a lot of enlightenment around it. Doesn't necessarily mean that it's about the end of the world. It just means that this is a very smart thing. That's what Jesus is about to say. He's going to talk about both at the same time, okay? So track with me for just a second. I'm sorry. I know this is like painful. We'll get there. I promise we're going to have something to do with this, okay? Just hang in there, okay? So Jesus is about to talk about both at the same time, Gulf and the ocean at the same time. Here's what he's going to say. Watch out that no one deceives you. For many will come in my name, claiming I am the Messiah, and will deceive many. You will hear wars and rumors of wars. Anybody heard that verse before as an end-time prophecy? But see that you are not alarmed. Such things must happen, but the end is still to come. Nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these are the beginning of birth pains. So do you see the destruction that Jesus is talking about? We're starting to see destruction happening. He goes on. Then you will be handed over and persecuted and put to death. You will be hated by all nations because of me. At that time, many will turn away from the faith, and they will betray each other. And many false prophets will appear and deceive many people because of the increase of wickedness, and the love of most will grow cold. Okay, so welcome to church. This is really uplifting stuff. Feels pretty good, huh? Yeah. Now, here's the thing. When we read that, some of us read that thinking that right now, I don't know, if you read that right now, you're thinking that actually sounds a lot like today, right? Sounds a lot like what's happening right now. And that is true, but I will also tell you that it's always been true. There's never been a moment where these things haven't been true. When I read this, I do think of, yes, this sounds like things that are happening in our culture, and this could be what's happening right now. But actually what it says here, it says, you will hear wars and rumors of wars. Actually, just so you know, worldwide, there's never been a day of peace globally since before Jesus, since what we would guess would be about 4000 BC. There's never been a day of peace in the whole world where everybody's completely at peace since that day. There's always been wars. There's always been rumors of war. Right now, actually, in the world, we are at one of the most peaceful places we've actually ever been, which is almost more scary in a way, is that we're not as at war as we used to be. Remember, this is now a zero-sum game. War is not what it used to be. It is much more expensive than it once was, and peace is actually more profitable than war. We're living in the first time that's ever happened. But for nations to trade with other nations, they make more money than they do by going to war with those nations. So we actually live in one of the most peaceful times in the human history, which is shocking. There's wars, there's rumors of wars. Some people would claim that was the Cold War, 1947 to what most people would say ended in like 1991. The Cold War was a big part of that. Some people would say that that's our maybe American understanding of this. There's just no reason that this hasn't happened or will continue to happen. He goes on, he says that there are going to be famines and earthquakes. You know how many people thought, and you can go back and find the writings, of how many people thought the world was ending? Not now. I know there's a lot of earthquakes and there's terrible things that the world is literally doing to itself. Nature is imploding upon itself. But you know how people thought the world was ending in 79 AD? What happened in 79 AD? Pompeii, one of the cities in Rome, was actually, remember this? There was a volcano that erupted. It literally burned the city and everybody was frozen in the lava. Fascinating story, interesting stuff, but you know how many people thought that was the end? Quite a few. We have writings to confirm. Most people thought this is it. And that was 79 AD. We've made it a little further past that. There's other things. You'll be persecuted and hand over to death. We see this idea all the time in America. We think that, we're being persecuted more than ever before, and Christians and whatever. That is a very Americanized version of this. There are countries where Christians are being persecuted. You know what's happening there? Is the gospel is spreading faster in countries where people are persecuted than it ever has in America where they have not been. China right now is growing faster in Christianity than any nation in history if you look at the speed. And actually, Africa is on pace to double what's happening in China in the next 10 years with Christianity spreading. So while in America, yes, it's starting to decline, globally, it's starting to increase considerably. These things, we can look at them from that type of point of view. But if we look at them globally, it's a whole different world. I mean, people talk to me, I've literally, and the reason I'm bringing this up is because I've had so many people confront me or just ask me, is this it? Are we there? Like there's a pandemic that's raging, you know, that's crazy. That seems like a thing that would happen at the end of the world. You know what? Yeah, sure. But if you go through history, you'll find that in the 1300s, there was the bubonic plague the first time, the black plague, the Black Death. And this happened throughout Asia and Africa, and it happened in Europe. And actually there, right, we know that there was at least over that century, 25 million people who passed from that. 25 million. That's unbelievable. It came back in the 1600s. We see it because Martin Luther actually wrote about it. He was a theologian who was living at that time. In the 1600s, he wrote about it. At that time in the 1600s, Italy alone lost 1.25 million. France lost another million people in that one in the 1600s when bubonic plague came back. And we globally right now are like 500,000. I mean, just think about the size of that. There's in the UK alone, in the last bubonic plague, they lost 15% of their entire population. 15% in just a handful of years. Imagine that. So think about this for a second. They've seen this before. In fact, in Rome, right after Jesus, not long after Jesus, just a couple hundred years after Jesus, in Rome, there was a plague. It was called the Antonine Plague, and it came in, and it actually it killed 5 million soldiers, just of Roman soldiers. And Rome, of course, thought, this is it. This is the end. We're there. Now, I'm not telling you this like to make you scared or whatever. I'm actually telling you to do this because I'm just saying I don't know. I mean, there have been all kinds of things that people look at. I have people talk to me about these things all the time. I think it occupies a lot of our mental space. I remember people told me that, oh, we've gone to new worlds now. We've gone to the moon, and that's probably a big deal, and that's probably some kind of end time thing. It's not. There's nothing in Scripture about that. But also, I don't know if you know what happened, not in 1969 when we went to the moon, but what happened in 1492 when a government commissioned people to go to a new world, and all of a sudden Christopher Columbus shows up and he finds a whole new world right there, like Aladdin, just a whole new world right there, and it turns out to be where we live now. A whole nother part that they didn't know existed. Or technology. People are like, well, we got these phones and information's moving faster than ever. And yes, that's true. We have the internet because Al Gore invented the internet. That's a joke. But we have the internet and it happened and we have phones in our hands. And I agree, that's like a whole thing. It's a big thing. But the reality is, you know when else people thought the world was ending because of information overload? Was actually in 1440 when the printing press was invented. This is true. You can find writings saying the printing press has given us more information than ever. Everybody has books. Everybody has information. And now this must be the end. We can find writings of people thinking that was it. I mean, it's fascinating. If I were to take all these things apart and say, like, look at all the different things, if I was to tell you there was going to be an economic crash, there was going to be a terrorist attack, and there was going to be a massive plague of sorts, all within about 30 years of each other, we would think it was our lifetime, wouldn't we? We would think that was ours. But that would happen 100 years ago. 100 years ago was the Spanish flu that happened, right? And then 10 years after that was the Great Depression starting, and 10 years after that was World War II starting with a terrorist attack here on our soil. These things have happened, and the problem is, I'm not saying that to scare anybody or whatever. I'm just saying it has happened, and it will happen. And when Jesus is talking here, he's not talking about a certain day or time. He's saying this has happened, and it will happen. But here's the point, and here's why this matters, is because my opinion is that he sees these things of destruction not about destruction. He sees them as a distraction. They are distractions to us more than they are destruction to us. Notice what he says, because after he talks about destruction, he talks about direction. He gives a direction. It happens in verse 13, and this is what it says. But the one who stands firm to the end will be saved. So first he says to stand firm, and then he says, and this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all nations. And then, after all nations, after all these things, after all this stuff has happened, then the end will come. And you guys, I got to break it to you too. I don't even know if the end he's talking about here, this is just to, and maybe I'm wrong. I have some theologians who would strongly disagree with me here. The end of the age is what they asked him for. The age could have just been Roman oppression. Could have just been that. We don't know what he's talking about here. If I was living in that day, I would have asked, basically, when is the end of this age? I want to get done with this one. So it's possible that's all he's asking or talking about. But he does say that what we need to know is there's two things. The direction he gives us is that you need to stand firm and you need to preach this kingdom to others. So let's start with the stand firm for a second, because I think what Jesus is saying here is you are so distracted, and these things are going to distract you. They're going to be distractions for you. And I think some of these things are distractions for us. Yes, we live in a time where there are terrible things happening, and the world is in bad shape, and things are difficult. Yes, that is all true. There are bad things happening, and there are some of these things going on. But what they are is they are distractions, and what he's saying is you need to stand firm in the midst of the distractions. Yes, we live in a world where there are these different things, like your phone, my phone, that is a distraction. Absolutely a distraction. I was reading that Apple did a study on their phones, and they found that the average iPhone user touches their phone 2,614 times a day. Touches their phone 2,614 times a day. And that's the average person. Like, my grandma owns an iPhone, and she's never taken it out of the box. So I don't know if she's included in that study, but I'm just saying she's on that side. Then there's some of us on the other side of that. 2,614 times a day. In fact, there are studies right now saying that your phone, if it's even in the room with you, even in the room, even if it's off, having a phone in the room with you actually lowers your ability to problem solve. It lowers your ability for memory. Now, we all think that's because we go to Google and we just search the things we want, right, instead of remembering any of the things we want to remember, and that's kind of true. But actually what they found is the reason that it lowers your problem-solving ability and the reason that it does this to your memory is actually just because it's occupying mental space in your brain that your phone is there. Just that you remember it's there. It's just always in your mind that you have a phone. And there's this world of people that you need to be connecting with or things that are happening out there, and you just assume that your brain, literally, you have mental space devoted to that device all the time. And don't think that we have to remember, don't think that's not the way they want it. I love Apple products. I have a lot of them. I'm just saying, don't think that that's not how they want this to work. Yes, you buy your phone, but your phone does not work for you. It works for some tech companies in California. And they want this. They want the attention that it brings and all the things that it does because that's how they drive revenue, that's how they drive sales, that's how they make money. Our phones are distractions. These are literal distractions. I was reading the other day in a book. It's a great book, but it's called How to Do Nothing. I've mentioned it before. But one of the things she talks about with phones is that she says that specifically with phones and social media, she said that the idea that you pick up your phone when you're talking to somebody else, like when you're sitting across a table from somebody or you're in a room with somebody, and the fact that you pick up the phone during that, she said what you're saying is that the people you are with and the place you are in is not enough for you. The people you're with, the place you're in is not enough for you. You need something else. And so you pick up a phone or a device while you're with them. And I think the same is true of what Jesus is saying about our faith, our walk with God, this standing firm, is that this is a distraction. And what we're saying sometimes is that that he is not enough for us. I don't know about you. For me, bedtime is a struggle. That's when I doom scroll like crazy, like just lots of phone time, or like maybe when you turn on Netflix or whatever, and you're just like, I'm just gonna unplug and unwind. And if I think about this is like an important time where I could be, especially in the Jewish tradition, this was when people spent the beginning of their day praying to God. They would actually spend time in their devotion time with God, essentially praying the Shema. They would spend time doing that every single day. And I think for me, if I was a Jewish person in that day, I'd be like, but did you know about this short, limited series on Netflix? Because it's a great crime thriller. And once you start the first one, you're going to have to go through all four. Then you're up till 2 o'clock in the morning. You got one sock hanging off, and you got Cheeto crumbs down your shirt. And you're like, this is worth it. But I don't have time for God. I have to watch this person that got killed, figure it out for myself. This is the kind of distraction that we have. I do think phones are part of it. I'll be honest with you. Social media is a huge part of it. I think we live in a world, yes, that Jesus is even talking about this. There is apocalyptic literature talking about things like having all this information at our fingertips. I do think it's dangerous. Right now, social media, the latest study I just read says that we spend 2 hours and 22 minutes a day on social media. 2 hours and 22 minutes a day. And it is becoming a complete distraction and actually an addiction that we are dealing with in our culture. These are things that will stop us from standing firm in our relationship with God because we are so distracted by these other things. It's not the destruction of the world that's going to take us away from him. It's the distractions of the world. News. Some of us love news. Some of us can't turn off the TV because we have a news channel we like. It could be Fox, it could be CNN. We have news we love. We love news. I was reading a study about news that really disturbed me this week. And actually one of the things it said was that the people who are most impacted by global events, by huge things that happen in the world, are not the people who were there. So, for instance, one of the studies was on the Boston Marathon bombing a few years ago. You remember this? And UC Irvine, University of California, Irvine, was doing a study on what news does to people's mental health. And they were doing a study on this anyways. And then this bombing happens, and they thought, well, that was all the way over in Boston. We're here in California. Let's see what it does to the people near us and the people far from us and how they handled this news, this thing that happened. And so they studied people who were actually at the event itself. They studied people who were relatives of people who were impacted by that event. And then they studied people who just watched the news of that event. What they found was the people who had the greatest mental trauma, the people whose mental health declined the most, were not the people who were there. They were not the people related to the people who were there. They were people who had watched more than 6 hours of news coverage about it. Those were the people who were most impacted by what had happened. News has actually become, I believe, a destructive and a distracting thing. I'm not saying we shouldn't stay informed. I'm not saying we shouldn't know about world events. I think it's important. I'm just saying we have to watch this, because what if this is one of those things that Jesus is talking about? Not saying it's a destruction of the world, saying it's a distraction of the world. And we need to be careful with it. There's so many things that he talks about that, yes, they happened then, but they also happen now, and they happen all the time. They're still happening on a daily basis. He says you have to stand firm. You have to be able to stand firm. I believe that these distractions add up. I believe that they are barriers to our spiritual life. I was reading a quote the other day by John Ortberg, and he said this. He said, "For many of us, the greatest danger is not that we will renounce our faith. Our greatest danger is not that we're going to renounce our faith. It's not that we're going to walk away from Jesus altogether." He says, our greatest danger is that we will become so distracted and rushed and preoccupied that we will settle for a mediocre version of it. Our greatest danger is that we will settle for a mediocre version of our faith. He said we will just skim our lives instead of actually living them. And you guys know as well as I do, at the end of your life is no more than a sum of what you gave your attention to. Our lives are just a bunch of moments of what we gave our attention to. If it was our families, that will be our legacy. That will be what our life was. If it was our jobs, that will be what our life was. If it was all of these distractions, that will be what our life was. And that will be what we have to show for it. Your attention that you give every single day is what your life will be spent on. And trust me, there are companies right now spending billions of dollars to get your attention. I'm not saying it's all bad. I'm just saying these are not just destructive things that Jesus talks about when he talks about this revelatory language and this apocalyptic language. He's saying these are distractions, and distractions are in and of themselves destructive. And the second thing he says is we have to be on message. He says that we will spread the gospel of the kingdom to every nation, to everyone. He's making this big claim that that's the other thing we have to be sold out on. And I will tell you, that is one thing that we talk about here at the church a lot, is the kingdom of heaven coming to earth and how we're part of that. I have struggled with this a little bit over the last few weeks, because I'll be honest with you, like as we were going through this pandemic, as we went through all this stuff, I remember it was a few months ago, I felt like our vision that we've always talked about of being a community that brings the kingdom of heaven to earth, I like that vision. I'm good with that vision. But I had this feeling of like we need to change those words a little bit. And I really actually sat down with this. I was praying about this, and I was asking God, like, what is this new vision statement? And I remember thinking, like, I love the idea of kingdom of heaven and coming to earth and how it connects with people and all these things. But I remember actually praying and thinking, like, there came a part of me, I'll be honest with you, where I felt like, God, is this actually what I need to be spending my time on? Like this kingdom of heaven thing, and thinking about what our church can do, and putting that into words and putting that into action. Is that what we need right now? Because let's face it, the world is all kinds of messed up. The world has so many needs right now. Is this the best use of my time? And you know what I actually felt God saying for the first time in my life? I've always been an action person, a doer, and all those things. One of the first times in my life where I felt like God was saying, no, this is exactly what I need you to do, because right now, more than ever, is when the world needs the kingdom of heaven in it. And so don't be distracted by all the other things that are happening. Be concerned about the kingdom of heaven coming to earth. That's where your energy needs to be focused, is how can you bring the kingdom of heaven to earth right now? Don't let these things distract you. Don't let them pull you down. Don't let them depress you. These are distractions, and your job is to continue to find ways where you bring the kingdom of heaven to earth right now. Don't let them pull you off course. You see what Jesus is telling them? This exact thing. Don't let these things pull you off course. Do not get consumed by the kingdoms of earth when I have already called you into the kingdom of heaven. And so I want to read just the end of what he says here. Again, if you read Matthew 24, there's a lot more to get into. If you read it, email me. I'm happy to go through it with you. It is a whopper. But he ends the whole thing in Matthew chapter 25. He continues for a whole other chapter. He starts telling stories. And I want to just give you the last picture that he gives as we wrap this up. If you could almost picture yourself hearing this for the first time. You've probably heard it before, but if you could almost picture yourself hearing this for the first time. If you were sitting on a lawn as a disciple of Jesus and you were sitting outside with him, listening to him tell this for the first time, I want you to think about the depth of this. Because I will tell you, if you do want to know what Jesus is looking for at the end of time, this is the only time he tells us his qualifications and what he's looking for those that will enter the kingdom of heaven and those that will not. He actually doesn't tell us that very often. He's asked a lot, what do I have to do to enter the kingdom of heaven? He almost never says. This is the only time where he gives us a clear picture of what that day will look like. Okay? And this is what he says, and I think it's something we have to take very seriously. Picture yourself hearing this from Jesus for the first time. He says, when the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him, he will sit on his glorious throne. All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate the people one from another as a shepherd separates the sheep from his goats. He will put his sheep on his right and his goats on the left. Then the king will say to those on his right, come, you who are blessed by my Father, take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you looked after me. I was in prison. You came to visit me. And then the righteous, they'll answer him, Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? When did we see you a stranger and invite you in, or needing clothes and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison and go to visit you? And the king will reply, truly I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me. Then he'll say to those on his left, depart from me, you who are cursed, into the eternal fire prepared for by the devil and his angels. For I was hungry, and you gave me nothing to eat. I was thirsty, you gave me nothing to drink. I was a stranger, you did not invite me in. I needed clothes, you did not clothe me. I was sick and in prison, you did not look after me. They will also answer, Lord, when did we see you hungry or thirsty or a stranger or needed clothes or sick or in prison and did not help you? And he'll reply, truly I tell you, whatever you did not do for the least of these, you did not do for me. Then they will go away into their eternal punishment. But the righteous, those who stood firm and those who continued to preach this kingdom of heaven, those will enter into eternal life. I don't think I have to do a lot of explaining about that. For us, I think there is a call on our lives that we can get so distracted by all of these other things. Yes, we live in a difficult time. Yes, there's a lot going on. But these things that we have built up in our heads, these things that we have made such big moments and even idols of sorts in our own minds, the things that are taking up so much mental space and capacity, those are things that Jesus is saying, no, I need you to continue to stand firm. And I need you to continue to stay on mission and preach the kingdom of heaven and bring it to earth for those, even the least of these. So let's pray together as we close this morning. And then we're going to sing as we wrap up. Jesus, we thank you for your words. We thank you for your teaching. We also thank you for your example. An example of being one who was concerned with the least of these, including us ourselves. We thank you for your example of caring for us and loving us. And now, because of your grace, your love for us, we have the charge, the ability to go out and love others. That we have this charge on our lives to be people who love you with our hearts and our minds and our souls and our strength, that we stand firm on that day after day after day, that we would not get distracted or disparaging or that we would get depressed about the things happening around us. Those would not take us off course. We would remind ourselves that we are on mission with you and that we would first love you with our hearts, our minds, our souls, and our strength. And secondly, that you would help us to love those around us, that we would be people who bring the kingdom of heaven to earth. We would love those around us just as you told us to. we see those in need, or just even those, not even physical needs or just financial needs, but those who have spiritual needs, those who have emotional needs around us, that we be people who can speak into their lives as well, that would bring the kingdom of heaven to them in what they're going through right now. We pray that we would not get distracted